In April 1983, a couple who'd been accused of murder gave an interview to detectives and local news crews.
They stated that they would confess to 2 other murders in California if they could have a press conference.
They wanted the world to know their insane, ludicrous religion, their beliefs.
A 6-hour drive away in Los Angeles, Jen Carson's mother broke the news to her.
She said, I told you that your daddy was really sick. He hurt people, and he's going to be going to jail to keep himself and other people safe. I immediately asked, are the hurt people dead? And she said yes. And I said, do they have mommies? And she said yes. And I said, are they sad? And she said yes.
Jen's father and stepmother were on a mission to rid the world of what they believed was a dangerous scourge.
Michael and Susan Carson were referred to in the press as the San Francisco witch killers.
You could become a witch just by looking cross-eyed at Susan, touching her. Anything that violated her, in her mind, she would order you to be killed. And her loyal disciple, Michael, would kill you.
This is around the time of the arrest. I just look so happy, and it's so sad to me to think 1.5 or 2 years after this photograph, I was a very suicidal child. And that just makes me so sad.
On the 10th of March 1983, what had started as a normal day for San Francisco detective Frank Falzon took an unusual turn.
I would come in every morning early, probably around 7 o'clock, and I would sit at my desk with a cup of coffee reading the San Francisco Chronicle newspaper, particularly 2 sections. I liked reading the Sporting Green, and I loved reading Herb Caen. You read Herb Caen, and you got the flavor of San Francisco for the day. He had all the up-to-date gossip. I started reading Herb Caen, and I came upon a kind of strange paragraph in the column about a murder in San Francisco.
The newspaper columnist had received a letter from an inmate called Michael Carson on behalf of himself and his wife Susan. Both had been charged with the murder of a man called John Hellier.
Michael had sent a letter to the San Francisco Chronicle saying he wanted to get more publicity about the crimes that they had committed. They were currently locked up in Sonoma County Jail and weren't getting proper publicity in that relatively small town, and they wanted to come to San Francisco and get publicity for their crimes there, including the killing of Karen Barnes.
I thought it was kind of strange to read that in the paper, so I went out to the front part of the office where books were kept on all the murders that occurred in San Francisco. And I started going through one book after another, looking for the name Karen Barnes. Karen Barnes' case was a cold case.
March 7th, 1981, police discover Karen's body in her apartment on her kitchen floor. And they begin to interview neighbors, friends, other individuals in the Haight-Ashbury community of San Francisco, and all state that she had a very strange couple staying off and on in her apartment.
James Michael Carson and Susan Carson were the suspects, but there were no linking evidence. They just knew that the Carsons had been living with Karen, so they were the prime suspects.
At the time Frank Falzon was reading that bizarre letter in the morning paper, Jen Carson had been in hiding from her father and stepmother for almost 4 years.
Looking back, I see that my father always had someone he was somewhat obsessed with. You know, when he was a child, he was an invalid and he was very attached to his mother. And then he seemed obsessed with my mother initially. And then he seemed very obsessed with me for several years, the first years of my life. He thought I was a psychic. He thought I was some type of religious creature that was being reincarnated, and would ask for my advice to make decisions. So, you know, he was both loving and bizarre at the same time. My parents met in university, and they were very involved in the counterculture war protest movement of the 1960s, and they were kind of hippies. When they finished college, they moved to a community in the South, to South Carolina, where white children and black children were placed in the same school for the first time, and many of the teachers quit. And so my parents moved down to that area to serve in one of those schools. At that time, my mom was pregnant, and she gave birth to me, their only child. And my father stayed home with me and decided to be a stay-at-home dad while my mother continued to teach.
I think around this time, about just under 40% of women were actually in the workplace. So this is quite unusual for them, but they appeared to be happy with this setup.
This is actually a picture they took right after they got married. It's kind of their wedding photo. They did go off and elope, so they took a picture together, and I think this is just a really beautiful picture. They're just so young and vital and happy. When I was about 3 years old, we moved to Arizona and the city of Phoenix. And my father continued to be a stay-at-home father. He, you know, brushed my hair every morning and got me dressed and made me breakfast and took me to the park and took me to the petting zoo and read me books, and was a really hands-on, you know, kind of hippie stay-at-home father. Individuals who knew my father as a teenager and as a university student, you know, describe him as brilliant, very rebellious, definitely with perhaps, you know, his drug use, or he had an interest in kind of more extreme politics, such as more extreme communism. But as they began to be adults and, you know, have a child and go into their career, you know, he's continuing to talk about, you know, overthrowing the government and talking about violence.
In the late 60s, early 70s, James and Lynn are involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement. They are very much part of that youth culture. This would have seemed very in sync with a lot of young people. But as Lynn and James become more settled in their family life, she is now focused on the family and providing for their family, but James is still part of this movement in his head.
James Carson's life increasingly began to revolve around drugs.
He was also selling marijuana, which was illegal at the time. So he would also take me on drug deals. So I remember bags and a gun with him and so on. And my mother at the time did not know he was engaged in that during the day when she was at work. My father really deteriorated at the end of their 10-year relationship. And he became very erratic. He went from being kind of an eccentric, you know, hippie in college to being a grown man who wouldn't work and who just wanted to kind of lay around and, you know, use marijuana.
I think for Lynn, making excuses for James's bad behaviour may have been her coping mechanism at the time. She may have also viewed him as a decent dad. because let's face it, she was going out to work full time. So maybe his relationship with his daughter, from her point of view, was working and was positive. And I think you tend to see this kind of behavior in people when they're trying to cope with a lot that's going on. Well, at least he's doing that, and that's okay. Everything else I will manage.
In this photo, I'm holding my little suitcase, and this is the day we moved to Arizona. And it really, my mom does not look happy in this picture. I think this is the beginning of the end. He also begins to get very violent. He always has a gun on him. Every time he becomes angry with someone, he says he's going to kill them. My mother is blaming the acid, the LSD.
LSD is a mood-altering drug. It does change perception. And I think she maybe thought, well, if he comes off that, he'll be okay. Then there are examples of him not being on any drugs and still being violent. And I think Lynn was just about hanging on. But I think the turning point for her came when there was a bit of broken glass that cut Jennifer's leg during one of Lynn and James's fights. And I think that for her was that was it. That was the last straw. She was not going to tolerate her daughter being harmed.
Lynn walked out, taking 4-year-old Jen with her. Within days, James Carson would have a new lover and a new name.
The moment that my father met Susan, she said, "Your name is Michael." And he said, "No, my name is James." And she said, "No, from now on, you'll be known as Michael." She then stated that she was psychic. She could see the past and the future, and that she saw that they were lovers in a past life. His birth name was James Clifford Carson, and from that night on, went by Michael Bear Carson.
He was taken in by this woman, and he was under her spell. And he was at her command to kill whenever she ordered him.
"1977 was a watershed year for James Carson. His wife and daughter had left him, and he met Susan, the woman who would become his new wife and his partner in crime.
After his obsession with me, he seemed to move on to her. And this then seems like the greatest obsession of his life. And I believe he very much wanted someone who would control him and that he could be subservient to this individual. And I think that this older woman played that role in his life.
The background story on Susan was that she had a good marriage. She had a son who was high school age. Her husband made good money, but it was not a life that she was happy with.
One night, my father goes to a party with a friend. It was at the home of a wealthy divorcee who was living a very bohemian lifestyle. And so my father met this woman that was, 10 years his senior, and he instantly becomes very enamored with her. He had bipolar 1, the more severe bipolar that would have delusions and mania. Susan was diagnosed as having schizophrenia as a child. And I think they had a strong bond over their drug use and a strong bond with shared delusions. And then I think both were also very hypersexual. So I think it was probably an intense sexual relationship as well. And then her desire to be dominant and his desire to be subservient. Soon after Michael and Susan meet, he never leaves. He comes to a party at her house, and they're together from then on.
They now seem to have become one person. They're operating as if it's us against the world.
She's making strange concoctions of food with barley and marijuana and LSD, and she says it will help them see more clearly the visions of the future.
They claim to have this variation of a Muslim religion, and that they knew when people were witches, and they had some sort of distorted view of astrology. I was never able to figure out where this witchcraft belief came from.
After Michael Bear Carson set up home with Susan, Jen became a regular visitor.
The first time I recall going to for a custody weekend at Susan's house, it was absolutely terrifying. So we got to the house and it was night, and they opened the door and there was a very large entry room. It had a bunch of potted trees. In my mind, it looks similar to the forest from The Wizard of Oz. And so I'm entering this room with these potted trees and no furniture and poor lighting, and it's dark, and there was nowhere for me to sleep. I recall sleeping on the floor, and the only furniture in the home was a waterbed. On several of the visits, I was coming back from the visit and telling my mother they didn't feed me. And I remember attempting to find food because they were passed out naked from drugs. And I remember attempting to escape from the home. I remember picking up a corded telephone and trying to dial anyone. And at one point I dialed 0 and saying to the telephone operator, "I want mommy."
I look at them as two individuals that felt that they had this experiment with drugs, started hallucinating, started fantasizing about being very important people, being God's disciples.
There were times where I would say things like, "I miss my mommy," and she would say, "Your mommy is a demon, she's going to hell." I have very vivid memories of crying and saying, "I want my mommy to rub my back." And Susan saying, "You want me to rub your back? I'll rub your back." And she scratched open my back with her jagged fingernails.
Jennifer is 4 or 5 years old. This is a horrifying space for any child, any person to be part of.
When I was returned to my mother, I said my back hurts, and that's when my mom found the wounds. I think anyone else would have called the police, but it was almost like she was so frightened and she felt that she just needed to get us away. And so at that point, she actually hid me at a church. She then is absolutely petrified, very much believes these people are really, really dangerous and that, this woman could kill me.
Jen would not see her father again for almost 20 years. In 1979, Michael and Susan Carson went abroad on a religious pilgrimage. When they returned, Lynn and Jen had disappeared.
Michael and my stepmother Susan began living this very nomadic lifestyle, and in 1980, and they're growing large amounts of marijuana on a marijuana farm, and then they are going to different locations to sell the marijuana. And they would go to Haight-Ashbury, which was kind of the center of the counterculture 1960s movement.
And there they encountered Karen Barnes, who was a young woman, age 23, who lived there, was a part-time housekeeper, was trying to get into acting.
They met her at a party where everybody was experimenting with LSD, mescaline, and peyote. And everybody was high. Everybody thought that Susan and Michael were strange, but not Karen Barnes. She was fascinated by them, and she invited them back to her home.
The friendship came to an abrupt and brutal end one night in March 1981.
Susan felt that she was a witch. And after doing all this drugs and tripping and LSD, she felt that Karen Barnes had to be killed. So when Karen was asleep one night on the floor, they hit her over the head with a frying pan. And as she laid unconscious, they stabbed her over 12 times, killing her.
March 7th, when Karen Barnes' body is discovered, Michael and Susan have just vanished into thin air. They had hit the highways and they were hitchhiking with their backpack full of marijuana, and so they've just vanished into the wind at this point.
A little over a year later, the couple struck again.
In 1982, Michael and Susan had been involved in an illegal marijuana farm, which is in Humboldt County in the northern part of California.
Susan is working, cutting and cultivating the marijuana, and my father is working security. Clark Stevens was from Southern California, from a small kind of surfing beach community, and one of his teenage best friends owned and operated this large pot farm.
One day in late spring, Susan decided she had a bad feeling about co-worker Clark.
Some sort of argument occurred, and she realized that Clark Stevens was in fact, he was a witch, and he had to be killed. So she ordered Michael to kill him. Her disciple, Michael, takes out the gun they had stolen, shoots and kills Clark Stevens.
They took his body out into a marijuana field, covered it up and buried it. They attempted to burn it, but that was not entirely successful.
Sometime later, there were some campers in the woods, some hikers that were camping, who their dog appeared to be playing with an object. And tragically, the dog was playing with the head of Clark Stevens.
So they called the authorities, and they came and searched the place, and they found the remains of Clark Stevens, and then that he had been murdered. So the people working at the farm said that about the time that Mr. Stevens went missing, that the two people who had worked there, Michael and Susan, had disappeared. But the only last name that they gave was Blair. And so when the police searched for suspects under the name Susan and Michael Blair, they came up empty because that was a false name.
Living on the run, making camps in the woods, the Carsons were not heard from again for several months, until one unusually cold morning in January 1983.
They had been hitchhiking from Bakersfield, California, and a man named John Hellier picked them up somewhere en route to Santa Rosa and they drove for about a day.
They were in a truck where there was just the single bucket seat. And so 2 people ride comfortably in a pickup truck, but 3 it's tight. And according to Michael and Susan, John's leg was touching Susan's leg. And, that was taken as some type of sexual overture.
And she said to Michael, I knew all along he was a witch. He's a witch. He has to be killed.
I believe they tried to kill him to steal the truck. But, they do claim that Susan said he's a witch, kill him.
So in an area in the northwest part of Santa Rosa, known locally as Fulton, the truck came to a stop on a river road, and witnesses observed a scuffle between Michael Carson and John Helyard, and eventually Michael Carson gained control of a pistol and shot John Helyard twice in the head.
Michael and Susan get back into the truck and they drive off. The police eventually spot their truck. There's a high-speed chase, and the Carsons are arrested and taken to Sonoma County Jail. It's where they remained until this article appeared in Herb Cain's column.
It was at this time Michael and Susan, already on remand for John Helyar's murder, claimed to have killed Karen Barnes.
Once I realized it was a homicide that was an open case in San Francisco, my partner and I immediately went to Sonoma County to interview the Carsons. Susan says, "No way. You want a statement from us? And you want us to admit to killings? We want the big city news to be here. We want to be filmed, and we want it in the newspaper." I said, I can arrange that. They wanted the world to know their insane, ludicrous religion, their beliefs. They thought they could end up with a flock of disciples, and that she could be the right hand of God, and she would have all these people following her, worshiping her.
In January 1983, Lynn Carson heard that her former husband had been arrested for John Helyar's murder and was in prison in Santa Rosa, California.
My mother felt some relief because she had then believed for 5 years that these people were dangerous and could kill her child or herself. So when they were arrested for killing other individuals, she felt incredibly sad for those families, but at the same time felt relief that her child was safe.
She's experienced this man becoming more and more violent in their relationship. So for her, this may have not been a surprise that, you know what, he went all the way because he was already in a very dangerous, violent space when I left him.
Soon after my father's arrest, the letters began. He would send long 7, 8, 9-page letters to any addresses that he had for any relatives who might forward the letters on. The letters were very rambling.
Do you remember your daddy? You were very small, beautiful. I had to go to Jerusalem. I came back, but I couldn't find you. I fought for God in a very bad place called San Francisco, where everyone hates God. does bad things.
And it says, suicide remarks are torn from fool's gold's mouthpiece, the hollow horn, whose wasted words prove to warn that he is not busy being born, is busy dying. That is just chilling to me, because I work as an expert on suicide. That's so bizarre to me that 25 years ago, he sent me this quote about suicide. Oh, that's chilling. Some of these letters I've never read in totality. Like, I would read a few lines and then I would get upset and put them away. I think I'm seeing this for the first time right now, and it just scares me to death. I need a minute.
In April 1983, Michael and Susan Carson used their press conference to reveal the full extent of their crimes.
We brought Susan Carson and Michael Carson into an interrogation room. We had the cameras going. We had the reporter there. We introduced the Bears to the press that they wanted, the media that they thought they deserved. And then I have to be perfectly honest with you. We sat there for 4 to 6 hours listening to the most disjointed, most nonsensical religious garbage I've ever heard. The fact that she was psychic, the fact that she was a messenger from God, and that he was a disciple and he would act upon anything that she instructed him to do, and he would agree. And I said, okay, please stay on the subject. Tell us about the killings. She would not. She had to tell us all about her religion. We listened, and then eventually she got to what we were there for.
Michael and Susan were suspects in 12 other cases. In 1983, there was no death penalty in California for a brief time, so they chose to confess to the murders in California as a legal ploy to stay in California. And so they then confessed to the 3 known murders in California, which is Karen Barnes, Clark Stevens, and John Hellier.
It seems that Susan was wearing the pants, so to speak, in this relationship. And on occasion, she would order Michael to kill the victim, and Michael felt that it was his responsibility to carry out the order. And it seems unlikely if they had never met that particular situation would have occurred.
So the adults in my life now know that my father's been arrested for multiple counts of homicide. My mom was very concerned that it would appear in the media, and she didn't want me to find out through the media. I was just 8 turning 9 at the time, and she said, I told you that your daddy was really sick, and you know his new wife is a very bad person, and that we were going to stay away from him until he left her and got well. And she said, unfortunately, he got much, much worse, and he hurt people, and he's going to be going to jail to keep himself and other people safe. I immediately asked, are the hurt people dead? And she said yes. And I just put my head in my hands and just sobbed.
This causes devastation for Jennifer as a child. She has to now go through a long process of disidentifying with the father that she remembers when she was little as the person that she loved, who looked after her and she had a good time with. And that's her narrative, has been utterly obliterated.
Several months later, I found newspaper articles that my mom had hidden in a drawer. And I remember trying to sound out and make out the word, B word, that I didn't know what it meant. And I now know that word was bludgeoned. But I came in contact with all of the gory details, you know, smashing a woman's head, stabbing a woman in the face, setting a body on fire. I came in contact with all of these horrific details. And then my battle with nightmares that went on for a couple decades began.
She also feels that she shares her DNA with her father, so does that mean she's a monster? And this is a very childlike perception of what's happening.
In June 1985, Susan Carson stood trial in California for the murder of John Hellier. Her attorney was Harry Allen.
It's a criminal defense practice, an issue that people can be legally insane. But in the case of a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, the person themselves is required to say, my plea is not guilty by reason of insanity. The catch-22 in that situation is that a person like Michael Carson or a person like Susan Carson, they don't think they're insane. They think they're absolutely correct.
Susan believed that she had a religious right to kill witches.
There were a number of trials and a number of appeals, and they went on for 9 years. And so I was, during that time, also very fearful that he would somehow be released on a technicality.
Eventually, all opportunities for appeal were exhausted.
In all 3 trials, the defendants were convicted of first-degree murder and received consecutive life sentences to the California State Prison.
So from the time I'm told of my father's arrest in 1983 until I graduate from university in 1996, I mostly do quite well in school, but I struggle with severe depression, severe suicidal thoughts off and on, and an eating disorder, and then really horrific nightmares. As a 9-year-old child, my whole life changes. You know, now I'm the daughter of a serial killer. And I struggle to process that. And I truly struggle to match up the idea of that Michael Bear Carson that I read about in the newspaper was the same person that braided my hair every morning and fed me breakfast. I couldn't reconcile this. And so I then, in order to cope, started, trying to think of him as kind of 2 separate individuals. I had to separate the 2 or I just couldn't move forward.
"1997 was a turning point for Jen.
At the time in the 90s, closure was a very pop psychology concept, something to seek. And so my best friend and I drove about 8 hours to Folsom Prison, where my father was incarcerated. And I thought it would be like a scene from the television show Law and Order, where there would be a glass and I would hold a telephone receiver and he would hold a telephone receiver. And so this sliding door opened and I'm in this open room. There's no glass, there's no receivers, and my father is hugging me. And so the last time I saw him, I was waist high to him. And now with heeled shoes, we're both 6 feet tall, and he's hugging me. And I'm just shocked, and I'm stunned, and I just am just frozen like a statue.
She's looking for the truth. She's looking for answers. She's looking for something that will enable her to close that chapter in her life. Some explanation, some remorse, something, some truth. He doesn't give this to her.
I realized that he was lying, he was manipulative, and I was going to get no answers. For example, he stated that my mother abused him, and that's why he became violent or what have you. So at that point, I was just wanting to disengage and leave, and I just needed to say goodbye and walk away. And so when I walked outside that prison and thought, my daddy doesn't exist anymore. James Carson does not exist anymore. That's Michael Bear Carson, and he is a pathetic creature, and he's like a rat in a cage. He's going to die in that prison, And when I left, I felt at peace about leaving and walking away.
In 2014, a law change in California meant older prisoners like Susan and Michael were permitted to apply for parole.
I began a petition campaign and a media campaign against their parole, and I clearly stated that neither of these individuals has felt any remorse, neither have been rehabilitated, and both would kill again if released. Karen Barnes' family, Clark Stevens' family, John Hellier's family, these are incredibly good, kind people, and it was incredibly traumatic for them to have a parole hearing.
It's scary to think of these two people back out on the street because they've never shown, to my knowledge, any remorse for their killings. Because in Susan's mind, they were killed for a reason. They were witches.
Thankfully, parole was declined and denied.
For Jennifer, she divided her dad in two, I think, as a coping strategy. The dad that she remembers when she was a young child who was loving, and the killer. I think what she's recognized as she's got older and integrated those experiences is that the dad that she remembers as a child actually never really existed.
James Carson, the man that brushed my hair and took me to the petting zoo, he was a mirage, and he never existed. There's only Michael Bear Carson, the monster that kills people and laughs about it. And I have nothing to say to Michael Bear Carson.
of the absnia for a yes, is it? What sich mir vor sie öffnen?
Slider if they got your the card, I'm the book starts my ish and night. Every barrock, every barry mawima, and yes, and this snack. Remember when mom, or mom, or when it's near, but see, remember the very fat. واحد يوصيش نميت زي ما عمري يسوي
Titanes y una entre los magas y una entre los magas y una πάνω σε σπίτια Ήμασταν θάλασσα κάτω από τα νερά κάτω από τα νερά Ήμασταν θάλασσα κάτω από τα νερά Ανέπνεα κάτω από το νερό Ανέπνεα κάτω από το νερό Ανέπνεα κάτω από το νερό Κάτω ήμουνα κι ανέπνεα Βρέθηκα κάπου στην έρημο Σαν να παίζω ράσταλα ήτανε στην ζωή Ήτανε
Dapper always so mod and night and her feel it's night. Her old money feels soft at my feels sitting for Wednesday with night. Girls the night need a little night and her fin my night. See did off the mirrors and their snack mouse. So there's the one myself. We still must go now, mammy. See did off was never. Dacht Marvel's next girl, Leary Vix, the red night, her was in the book it's night. Stand so in the saw had a spout the worst near her little spot. So it saw as we smart that snacky we sucker off my push and you lock her at my surface.
As this if Valley root me a gymnash. Nazis, the way was this in the saw, gabble, yammed fat.
Marf me at feel. Fire slither, wire gift. We still be a reservoir. He's the arts of a who's the notes. For those must I had night. Such the world will be now. Who near the night? And there's still no zoom of an share if I had me out kid.
First be fit fast in the jib eat. Hillary from east. Meth was that snake ma he sell and I'll worry ma snake up the blue business near sneak games.
Well, would snack socks if isn't here and the no market but me swine yet.
No, I'm afraid I get written that saw her either bit or smacky sweeler bunny. Steam as this night, all camp my earth kindness. Snipers, but see, Biscarias, and a mighty Biscarias, and then law was a fish and shaler, which has nothing in a lark, so we can get their soul, scratch her hair of a star, poking it and neck, ma. Snazul the brush, the snob nurse at night, sweet garter, the snob nurse said, I hit me at that night. Spoilage does that high for 6 never soon got some nazis. I named this in the shoe look back at whether a little bit brave this room, but now we're a little bit. Dahi Earth over my ears, making my heel, a snitty, snipe, and my Ernie sister in that 20, so I am upset. I'm rid of him, or snip. Oh, I just found me what beer of me will so. Yes, over the flower, the more that so it's not for the heater of my wish, sugar of him, and no.
The wee wish that fell along so you know, look him, nibs of her, Na, Sneeuwksjazo, Nasresh, Schneram, Gira, Hish. That's so. Nazus, no, you're snark at with it.
Fails in a lord, I built Nemortal Mass, the thing at Yana. Horse driven as if neighbors, but see, Vicky in that my horse. Though we know must then all wish I marry feel that night. Fails if the Nashas better with us miss not said night. Her not be missy him, the Nashas was her fat.
Mjorking in opties na. Fjall weens him ook get the win him with. And as you stamina, Miss Felder has lost net fjallsy. The socks me as the fake that she stole was on the vassis nevas me snan.
Measure all Easter venom. Oh, it's Nam Gerhat. So we, ne. Oh, I'm sure no so we, no moves. Yeah, I'm in the so we.
That's right, we'll come out. No, not an emergency. Snack, that's rocker vaccination. So, man, through pass the fails happen as a valor with the vassish in that. Hirsch, even the sap, but it's the cake, yes, I wish I did it. And that the oh, comes in only like no, I'm referring to this net. Smash, I mean, I'm going to see it. Oh, comes in a decision. And as this, I'm read off and bad, never.
Mian wind na. Have a luin that flat on the socks me as see as neither. There when as glory of me guests last all one ill.
Morgen je bestoot na lost is niet on so we short solid so that's what have I mean the office is meer net nil verlongerisch gals finish ach that's all gerp but so it now me have me ook niet niet help longing aber such so nil niet help de lang van je boys net schouws niet en nog je on me versuch mal es gerät net ja we Fos mag ich viel ob auf wie ein Bisch na nicht es nicht sagt immer Harsh mir so ja sie ist
we sell in the side an email there them ما ضح اكسساسي هنا ما تسوي ناس ما كبي ما احضر ما هنا انا بس سواء هنا اللي عبير استايش سناجي بس واي na اذا ناجي بتسني Hirsch Dipson, answered Mamma. Healer rich night. And was there it when we waited to sit Nessie, we sort of hammy long. Word of sin.
Shinam will be slang it through. Yeah, Miss Anna. I've used this heel illo. No, you ex of all of the work is now stand up with me if you're heaping up to this is not speaking if you're not. First is off so. I hope so. We versnelpen, maar stoot zit op een schelle bezig. Ik ben best meer stof uit een exhibition is zelfs als na het ziet dat ze met nu vessel vermis maar dat dan bezig kan ik werken en heb hem ik heb is meer de fysiek ging ik hem net niet
and all where I'm sweet I need the my rail and I can opposite and I girl the we and I am no that ni bist der lach na ibe honey Ersnes in it vinach ni merf now we get our make it be night fashion shillery nest her it was not eat that ma the dearest dealer for the fam